Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Andrew Tabler, the Martin J. Gross Fellow in the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute. And it's a pleasure for you to be with us here today. If I could just ask you in advance before we start to silence your phones and not accept and talk on the phone when we're having this conversation. Today, I'm happy to announce today's policy forum, Promoting Political Pluralism in the Middle East. 7 years after uprisings that shook the Middle East and North Africa, many civil society leaders, activists, politicians, and journalists from U.S. allied regional states are worried that Washington's attention to political pluralism is waning. To better understand these concerns and explore future avenues for U.S. engagement, the Washington Institute is pleased to host a policy forum with three such figures who are visiting Washington under the auspices of the Halling Center for International Dialogue. And they're going to be joined by our own fellow here and an alumnus of the Halling Center, Bilal Wahab. The first to my left is Aboubakr Jamai, is Dean of the School of Business and International Relations at IAU College, where he focuses on Middle East politics, media, and conflict and related issues. To his left is Lobna Jeribi, is founder and president of the parliamentary think tank Solidar Tunisia. She has served as a member of Tunisia's National Constituent Assembly and co-founded the citizens movement #Open for OpenGov and OpenBudget. And to her left is Oussama Sghaier, is a member of the Ennahda Party political bureau, the Tunisian Assembly of the People's Representatives for the Constituency of Italy, the Parliament's Security and Defense Committee, and the Commission for Investigating Networks involved in sending Tunisian youth to conflict zones. And last but not least is Bilal Wahab. Bilal is the Nathan and Esther K. Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute, and he is taught at the American University of Iraq, where he established a Center for Development and Natural Resources. This is a bit of I think, not only a great opportunity for us to talk about this important subject, but this group that we have in front of us here, which was brought by the Halling Center, is the product of an earlier meeting that the Halling Center had last November. And so instead of botching explaining this and a little bit what was behind it, I'm just going to ask to my right, Michael Collins here, who to explain a little bit about how this meeting came to be and how this group came to be in front of you. So please.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And my thanks also to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for hosting this event today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Halling Center, we're a non-governmental organization that was founded by an act of Congress in 2004 with a specific mission of trying to foster dialogue between the United States and Muslim-majority nations. And in service of that mission, we host dialogue conferences abroad that deal with underserved but also topics of interest and importance to that relationship. The participants that you see here standing here today were part of that meeting, and Bilal was actually part of a previous meeting that we had done at the Halling Center. For the past few months, the Center has conducted a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation to foster dialogue between civil society and political leaders from across the Middle East about the challenges of closing civic space, the Islamist-non-Islamist divide, and other national and regional political issues. The Center hosted a regional meeting in Tunis last November, featuring participants from Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey. And during that meeting, participants examined some fundamental questions of Middle East politics, reflected on the current tensions between ideologies, evaluated the state of civic engagement, discussed the roles of external actors, and generated some recommendations going forward. And we actually have a copy of some of those recommendations here, which you can pick up on the way out the door. This is part of the second phase of the program, and we brought participants, a select group from the dialogue last November, to Washington, D.C. for two distinct purposes. One, it's so that those participants could have more exposure to the development of foreign policy here in the United States, particularly in this city. And second, so that experts, think tanks, policymakers here in the U.S. can have direct exposure to people that know the situations that are going on the ground and hopefully open up a dialogue between the two sides that's broader than the meeting that we had last November. So again, my thanks to all of you for being here today and for having this discussion.
Sure.
Back to you.
And thank you, Michael. Carol, sorry, not Collins. I had Irish independence on my mind. Hopefully, it's a great goal. Yeah, I just took the Ancestry DNA test, and I found out I'm much more Irish than I ever imagined. So please excuse me. In any case, I will hand everything. We'll go right down the line. Aboubakr, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So what I'm going to try to do in these 7 minutes that are allocated to me is to look at the Moroccan case and to try to give you my view on how Morocco is faring and what we can expect from the future. And to do that, we need to go back to at least to 2011. The prevailing view about Morocco is that the Moroccan regime has been able to ride the wave of the Arab Spring. So it looks like a positive story coming out of the region, and I stress looks like. First of all, we need to agree on the metrics of success. I mean, obviously, if your frame of comparison is the region and you compare Morocco to Syria, Yemen, of course, Morocco is a success story. But is it really the kind of standards we want to apply to the region? And there are two reasons why this framework is not a valid one. The first one is, as a Moroccan, I'm not really happy to have my country compared to failed states and failed nations. I believe that great strides have been made by Democrats, militants in this country to achieve something better than what we end up with. So this is from the Moroccan standpoint. And secondly, Tunisia had taught us a lesson, which is we should be careful with the concept of stability, because before Bouazizi lit up his match in December 2010, Tunisia was stable, and then all of a sudden the whole region became unstable. So we need to agree on how do we measure the stability of a country, and the lack of or the absence of demonstrations, what seems to be strong security apparatus, etc., are not necessarily guarantors of stability, as the Tunisian regime has taught us. And in fact, to me, what we've been doing was to confuse stability with stagnation, and the way to differentiate between them is to look at metrics like youth unemployment. I think that's the big one, actually, because if you look at what happened across the region, we can agree that demographically speaking, it is this particular segment of the population that kick-started what we call the Arab Spring in almost all of the countries. So this is a big issue we need to look at. And then poverty, equity, etc., etc. To me, these are much more salient parameters we need to look at to evaluate the future stability or the continuous stability of a country or a lack thereof. Going back to how should we judge what happened in Morocco since 2011, in terms of youth unemployment. So if we take youth unemployment as being an important factor in stability, well, I'm sorry to inform you that youth unemployment has worsened since 2011 in Morocco. And it worsened in the worst part of the country when it comes to destabilization in the cities, because we know that urban youth unemployment is really the right metric we need to look at. And it had worsened. I think that the last figures published by the Moroccan government states that youth unemployment in the cities in Morocco is around, I think, 45%. And the picture is even bleaker than that, because the 50-something% that remains, 2/3 of them work in the informal sector, right? So they basically in the jungle. So it means corruption, it means insecurity in their daily life, etc., etc., etc. So that's why it shouldn't be a surprise for you to hear that the north of Morocco has exploded into demonstrations, like it happened in the Rif. That Jarada, which is another city close to Al Hoceima, which is a city which was the locus of the main demonstrations for months, has also is also right now witnessing demonstrations. And that, we should brace ourselves to that type of demonstrations and activities to happen. So on that level, there is certainly a failure. Now, to what should we ascribe this failure? When we talk about unemployment, and we do know that the state's ability to provide employment has been for, I can almost say decades now, has been tremendously diminished. We're talking about the private sector. So the question becomes, how should we incentivize entrepreneurship in the country, et cetera, et cetera. And then we need to do a little bit of political economy and to wake up from the myth and the dream that the regimes have basically propagated for many years before the Arab Spring, which is to say, okay, you, the IMF, the World Bank, and the EU, the United States, you're telling us that we need to, the states needs to leave space for the private sector, so we'll give you the private sector. And we ended up not with the private sector, we ended up with the Sopranos. We ended up with the families controlling the economies. And that's the reason, and when I say the Sopranos, that's what a mafia is. I don't think there is one mafia movie in which you don't have the following line: I am a businessman. But I am a businessman not obeying the law. And that's what was happening in these countries, producing these rentier elites with a substandard, suboptimal economic system, not incentivizing the right of entrepreneurship we are looking for, the Schumpeterian entrepreneurship with risk-taking, et cetera, et cetera. And we ended up with the Mubarak family controlling the private economy. We ended up with the Ben Ali family controlling the economy, and Mohammed VI basically controlling, being the major shareholder of the first bank, the first insurance company, et cetera, et cetera. And that's substandard. That's directly, it feeds into the lack of employment that these countries are suffering from. Another metric is political participation. We should expect from a system which is opening up that people are buying into this, this narrative and participating more. Again, I'm going to give you one data. Casablanca, which is considered to represent 30% of the Moroccan GDP. During the municipal elections of 2015, if my memory is right, the participation rate was 28%. And this is the participation rate which is based on an electorate of 13 million Moroccans, which are who are registered in the official lists, whereas we know that there are 23 million Moroccans who should be voting, who are in age of voting. So in fact, we're talking about 15 to 16% participation rate. So my point here is that economically and politically, in fact, what's supposed to be the good story coming from Morocco is not good at all, because it's not producing more political participation. People are not, and by the way, I mentioned Casablanca. The participation rates are lower in the cities, which is counterintuitive when you talk about developed countries, because in the cities you have a higher income, you have a higher level of education, et cetera, and hence you should have greater political participation because people are more educated, et cetera, et cetera. It's the contrary in countries like Morocco. In fact, it's a sign of opposition to the system that those who are supposed to vote generally, because they are more mindful of political things, they are more politically aware, they're not voting. So their non-vote is a political action. It means something. It's a deliberate action, which is hence the case in Morocco. So we have this marginalization of big groups in the cities, economically and politically. If we don't have the type of institutions that are incentivizing the entrepreneurship we're looking for to produce the jobs that are the real stabilizers of the economy, then we'll basically just kicking the can down the street. Einstein defined stupidity by the fact that we are expecting the same causes to produce different outcomes. And to me, this is what's kind of happening right now with Sisi, maybe with other countries as well, I think with Morocco, etc. We think that a Mubarak square would produce more stability, and I don't think that's, we've been there. We know what happened. So it's not working. We know that it is not working. Now the issue is, okay, I am stating that this new political contract is not working out after 2011. What's to be done? What is the alternative? And that's a very important question. So we can be as critical as we want about the regime in Morocco. We need to answer the following question: what is the alternative to the current regime in Morocco? And there is a void there. And my point is that the reason why people are did not reach the point of rejecting the monarchy, because the monarchy remains popular, at least with some groups. So we cannot claim that the monarchy is unpopular, to be untrue. But I think this popularity is more based on the absence of an alternative. And this alternative has to be, and that's why the Holding Center work to me is absolutely key, has to be some kind of constitutional understanding between the seculars and the Islamists. That's what a constitution is about. A constitution is about opposed ideological groups agreeing on a common denominator, agreeing on the rules of the game, and agreeing on the sanctuarization of certain rights. That's your Bill of Rights, by the way. Okay, that's what a constitutional moment is. And we need this constitutional moments because we didn't have it in Morocco. We need the seculars and the Islamists to agree on what a Bill of Rights would look like, how we can protect women's rights, minorities' rights, religious minorities, every kind of majorities, right? And then how we can organize the political, quote-unquote, game. There are two good news here. The first one is what to me was a surprise. I'm ashamed to say, but also a wonderful surprise, is that if you had told me in 2010 that in 2011 we'll have dozens of thousands of Moroccans demonstrating weekend after weekend after weekend, that's what happened. Peacefully, I wouldn't have agreed with that, because the history of Morocco, whenever we had massive demonstration, they ended up in riot, and that was a big trump card for the regime, by the way, to stifle this type of political activities. And what happened? We had a wonderful lesson from the Moroccan public opinion, because we had these demonstrations, they were peaceful, and when the violence occurred, it was from the state, not from the demonstrators. And it's not, I think it's becoming a hallmark of contestation in Morocco, because it's exactly the same thing that happened in the Rif. The Rif in the north of Morocco, where we had these successive demonstrations, they were led by a movement which was very well organized, very civilized, very peaceful, with a very well thought and laid out demand, and that's good news. So the potential of explosion from that angle, to me, the likelihood of them to happen is a lot smaller. The other good news is the Islamist parties. I think one of the biggest achievements of the Tunisian constitution is the freedom of conscience clause in the constitution. And to me, it's really a game changer. Once you have that in your constitution, it can't fail to have an impact on the rest. In Morocco, the two most important Islamist movements, and I saw that WINEP had published a little booklet on L'Adl wal-Ihsan. So L'Adl wal-Ihsan, Justice and Charity, and the PJD group both agree on the freedom of conscience clause. And actually, during the constitutional process, the one institution that opposed it was the monarchy. The reason the monarchy opposed the freedom of conscience clause was because the kings or elites around the king believe firmly that his legitimacy is based on his title as a commander of the faithful, right? So the argument was, okay, he is the commander of the faithful, is if a faithful decide not to remain a faithful anymore, he's outside of the purview of the authority of the king. So what we do by inserting this freedom of conscience clause in the constitution, what we do is that we weaken the monarchy as an institution. So to me, this is, of course, the bad news is that the monarchy and the elites around the monarchy are not willing to let go of this. And of course, the market employ, the peddle outside of Morocco is we are the proponents of this wonderful, open, progressive Islam, and we have these bad guys, wild-bearded guys, etc., etc. But in fact, some of them might be sincere, but most of them it's a tool of power. But the good news here is that the most potent Islamist movement in Morocco have announced that they are in favor of the freedom of conscience clause, which means that their constituency somehow is also in agreement with it. And I think I'll stop here.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lobna.
Thank you. I'm usually intervening after Oussama, so Oussama was very rosy, and so now I will have to make the rosy situation of Tunisia, and then maybe we'll speak. Of course, the first step, as Aboubakr said, Tunisia has made a huge step in building democracy. We have this progressive constitution with liberty of conscience, with women rights, with young rights, with social economic also rights. It was a huge accomplishment. It was participative approach and process with civil society, with the citizen participating, with region participating, the civil society has won a Nobel Prize for led a national dialogue during a crisis and political crisis during the process of drafting constitution. So, of course, that was not natural, I would say. That was after fights. You have spoken about the OpenGov movement. Actually, I'm not a founder, but I was just actively participating in OpenGov to make, we were 50 years, we have a black box parliament, so we have to move to open parliament, so we have to fight within the civil society to make our parliament open to civil society, open to media and committees, open also. So, and this is the attitude is continuing. We have this reflex also always to come back in a lot of democratic issues, and we have always and each day to fight as civil society actors. The revolution was built up on two principles. As we said yesterday, it was dignity and freedom. This is what Tunisian people call for. And we have kind of also some analysts in Tunisia speak about two revolutions. We have the revolution of 14th of January, and we have the revolution of 17th of December, which was in a region. It started from the deep regions where we have a huge poverty and unemployment, and they called for dignity, they called for employment and for social economic rights. And then it was reached up by the 14th January in the center by people who called maybe more than freedom. So some analysts say that we have reached kind of freedom of speaking, kind of democratic and political process. We are advanced on them, but the social economic rights and the dignity is not yet reached. So for political advancement, yes, we are building actually after the constitution drafting the institutional or the committees, justice committees, anti-corruption, because we have a huge corruption in deepened in our institution, and we have to build up a long-term institution to fight against corruption. We have independent committees that are part of the state, but they are kind of counterpower, and we are enhancing a new decentralization, which is also a new process for Tunisia to make regions, to have power in regions, and to have local election, local governance, and more participating for local citizens in their policy and regional development. So this is also a very huge accomplishment. But I would say that the ideological divides during the process constitutional drafting has covered the social economic debate. And during building up the political institutions, and we have, I would say, consumed all our resources, we have left all social economic problems, social economic reforms are not enhanced and not yet enhanced, and the economic transition is kind of blocked actually. And for this there are a lot of reasons. I would say, of course, that we have this kind of technical reasons. We have weak administration. We are learning, all institutions are learning this new democracy, but we have also problem of political governance that we have to make more productive. And we have spoken with regarding even how can we improve our mechanism of dialogue to make them more effective, because the consensus was the magic word during the first step. We have made a consensual constitution, we have made this national dialogue with the Nobel Prize, but actually this consensus is not working in the social economic issue. It's maybe even more the vector of immobilism. So we have to create and find out new mechanisms to enhance and to accelerate our social economic reforms. Actually, we have structural deficit budget. So we have really to reform our public function, we reform our administration, to have tax reform, we have subsidiary reforms, and these are essential actually to solution our budget. But what is more than numbers, maybe what is the danger here is that in somehow in Tunisian thinking, the danger is that we associate indirectly the democracy to less of power purchase, to more poverty, and this is maybe will make Tunisians less mobilized for this revolution. So we should be always confident to our democratic transition process, and that's why the social economic issue is very important now. What I would say is that politically there is an opportunity actually, because the decentralization process, we have youngs, we have 52% of our candidates list in local election are young people, less than 30 years, I think. And this is really, it would be a chance, because these young that were excluded from, I would say, during these 7 years from this governance, from participating because they were active during the revolution, they will be now participating in a local level. They will be participating and maybe learning also somehow in this maybe force of proposition to their locality and regions. And this is a vector of creating a new generation of politicians and of maybe new movement that will be maybe create the alternative, the political alternative that will inspire this new generation, that will inspire new people, because even in our country, it's maybe all over the world, but in our country there is this lack of confidence with political parties. So we have to re-engage citizens and to re-engage young to believe in themselves and to believe in politics, and to create this movement of to inspire this new generation. I have finished.
Okay, sorry. Perfect timing, exactly. Thank you so much for that. Okay, Oussama, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity, and thanks for coming. I'm not going to talk negatively about Tunisia, and I think we're doing a good job. We have difficulties, problems, but without even confronting what we have in Tunisia with the other countries that they had the Arab Spring, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, so it's clear that there is a big difference. But I feel personally that the difficulties that we're facing in Tunisia, they started to be the difficulties of a normal democracy. Major difficulties, but of a normal democracy. So my point is, we're starting really to move or to end this democratic transition. We didn't finish yet, honestly. But I think we're slowly going to be, particularly with the election of 2019, so in 2 years, because it's the end of the year, so in 1.5 years, to stabilize our process. Still a born democracy with a lot of difficulties. It is hard to make choices within with democracy. I mean, dictatorship is so easy. One guy decides for everyone, and that's it. Democracy is not an easy. It's not easy. It's not an easy job for politicians, for MPs that are not used to make decisions this way. So we need time to really enforce our democracy with the support of our friends, that they want a real democracy in North Africa. Otherwise, the difficulties are really, really so high. So I'm not going to talk a lot, but what went different in Tunisia? I mean, what was that different that made Tunisia better, a better example through democracy? First of all, I think since the beginning, since 2011, we understood that democratic transition cannot led by simple majorities. We need large majorities, actually very large majorities. So even the first year, so before the election, as Tunisian, what we've done is that we made like a kind of large committee that decided the first year choosing a government and going for election and calling for a constitutional committee. And who was there? Everyone was there. It was really hard to imagine those different people that they were in this committee. But they managed to make a lot of good decisions. And then after the election, we thought to do the same. Actually, the Constituent Assembly was made by an electoral law that we're suffering a little bit today by that electoral law, because it's not easy to change electoral laws. But at that time was good because it didn't give the chance to anyone, Ennahda included, to be the main political parties over all the others. So it gave a chance to small parties, independents and so on to be together and to build the country together. So the thing is the large majority. So we understood that large majorities is the way to run a democratic transition. Second, and very, very important, the space that we gave and they took. Actually, maybe they took and we were happy of it, of the civil society. No one gave them anything. Actually, they were very active, making an important pressure on politicians, on the parliament, on the government, and so on. So, and was a very important pressure to MPs and to political parties to go in the right way. And at the end, I mean, how we made it. I mean, as Lobna was saying, there is two big major challenges. Which is the name of the revolution in Tunisia, freedom and dignity. With freedom, it is the political system. Free election, democratic institutions, free media, religious, freedom of conscience. We did it in Tunisia, actually, and was an important decision, and so on. The other challenge, and I'll go to talk about, is the dignity one, so the social and economic one for the regions that they expressed their voices during the revolution, the marginalized areas in the inside countries. Actually, when we look also to the coast area, we were going to find a lot of villages and cities, small cities, that they are really marginalized. So anyway, the real civil society and large majorities is accepting to sit around the table and make decisions peacefully. Even if you think to those people, they had really, really very different positions if we look back. So this is it's very important. The Tunisian society, it is moderate one. It is a peaceful one. It is a society that wants to solve problems, not wants to preserve his own idea and without accepting any other ideas. So Tunisians, I think, as population, and at the end we took a Nobel Peace Prize for the Tunisians after the agreement of 2014. We had the election, and then we moved to the economic challenge. And here, actually, we have to be honest, we're still having real difficulties. It is not easy to do reforms in democracy and in a born democracy. because there are a lot of stakeholders that they are against changes. Political changes, okay, freedom and so on, going for election. Ben Ali is not there anymore, so it is easier to do it. It's just let's make an agreement to have a democratic constitution. But the economic challenge and to move the situation of the country from the situation that we had before the revolution and to the new one, it is not easy at all, because you have the union in Tunisia that they are stopping, honestly, a lot of the reforms that we are doing. They have their normal and acceptable concerns, we have to say, but sometimes those concerns are not really for the benefit of the country. The administration in Tunisia, think about it as the French way, because we used to be colonized by the French. So it is really a very strong administration. It's not easy at all to make changes, and sometimes we do reforms in the parliament, hardly we approve them, and then we took like 1 year, 2 years, even 3 years to implement them. So the capacity of the new democratic institutions in Tunisia is one big question that needs to be supported and needs to be to work in a better way to give real results to the Tunisians. At the end, we're living in difficulties, but the numbers are good. GDP, unemployment. If we look back, the year of the revolution was almost 18.8. So almost 90% of unemployment, mostly in youth. Still mostly in youth, but we're in 15.5. Still very high, but it gives us a process of a positive one, if in particularly if we're going to arrive to 2020. So the real problems are on how to have a better capacity on doing reforms, and here I think the US should support us more on this. There are real institutions. As an MP, many times we face reforms without a real without enough information and not having a good complete information on the reform that we're doing. So this is affecting the reforms. Sometimes they're not good enough. Think about CRS, the Congressional Research Service. I'd love to have something like that, smaller, but with this idea, so to give the information to MPs, to parties, so to know what are the positive part, what are the concerns, and so on, so to be able to do a better reforms. To go quickly, one important point. The other thing that I want to talk as another member is what happened in Tunisia. In Tunisia, with Ennahda Party, we refused the word political Islam, simply because we put under the political Islam many groups that they are very, very different between each other. You put sometimes Ennahda, Brotherhood, PJD, ISIS, and so on and so on. Which are groups, some of them, they refuse totally democracy, the democratic system. Some others, they think the democratic system is the best one. Some of them, they use violence and they have militias, and some others, no. So for us, we prefer to call ourselves as Muslim Democrats Party, a party that represents a conservative, moderate part of our society, a party that thinks that the identity of the country is something important. We have to give importance to this, but in a way to include it in a democratic system, so to give a space to avoid extremism. And this is what happened in Tunisia. In Tunisia, the success came from excluding extremism and trying to put together around the table moderate secular and moderate Muslim Democrat, the Ennahda Party, and Mr. Beji Qaid al-Sibsi with his party, Ennahda Tunis, and all the other parties around us, that they were part of this democracy, sitting around the table. So I think, and I understood that the time is the way that we try to understand in Ennahda, to move and to express clearly that we are Muslim Democrats, to express it better. Many of us, they lived in Europe and also here. Think about the Christian Democrat experience in Germany, in Italy. This is something that we feel represent us. But we're near, we prefer we see much more similitude with the Muslim the Christian Democrats than any other political party in the region, because it's representing a moderate identity and at the same time being a party that thinks for the interests of the country. Last point, I would love to stress the importance of the U.S. support in Tunisia. The counterterrorism help that we had from the U.S. was very important to protect our democracy. There are a lot of examples, the help that we had in our border with Libya and so on. And this should not stop, because one action, one terroristic attack will really make big difficulties for our tourism and so on. The other thing is we had not only counterterrorism help, but also to have a sustainable democracy. We really need a technical support to do the reforms and to have a better experience from the U.S. with his huge experience. We need a real support for the new democratic institutions. We do not. We have to avoid the idea to the normal people in the internal regions to understand wrongly that democracy is a good thing to express their ideas, but it is not something that we can build the country. It is not something that is going to give a better life for Tunisian. Democracy actually is the right solution, and we have to enforce the new democratic institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Lobna, you had a quick... is it a point of clarification, or
No.
because we have a discussion session after this? So
Okay.
yeah, I think we can get into, it'd be better just to have Bilal, I think, go next, and then we'll get into the discussion. You're free to interact.
I just want to say that we didn't speak about this. Oussama have spoken about reforms, and I have this book, which is like kind of activity report of 2017 of our think tank, and it's regarding institutional and social democratic reform, accompanying the parliament for it, and it's I gave some copies, so if you are interested, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.
That's great. Okay. Last but not least, our own Bilal Wahab. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here, and I know that this event competes with other more interesting events happening in Washington, D.C., so I particularly appreciate...
you mean today?
Well, yesterday and
right.
today. The news cycle is moving in interesting ways. It's also definitely a pleasure to be sharing this panel with you all. The work that you do on the ground is quite inspiring. I wanted to probably reflect on the experience of Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan in pluralism, but also competitive politics. I'm intentionally avoiding the word democracy. Usually this town has, I call it the American foreign policy extremism toward engagement with democracy and with Middle East. It's either full engagement and there is a full throttle of democracy promotion and freedom agenda, supported by 150,000 troops on the ground. This has been the experience of Iraq. Or a complete disengagement where there are 0 soldiers on the ground and Iraq becomes basically looked at through the rear view mirror. The case of Iraqi Kurdistan in particular demonstrates the value of commitment. Usually, the United States has been very good in nation building in Asia. You have the Japanese example, the South Korean example. Very good in Europe. You have the Marshall Plan. But democracy promotion and nation building doesn't work in the Middle East. This is sort of the sense that we're getting increasingly in some circles, foreign policy circles, that even if we did it right in Europe and in Asia, we're not good at it in the Middle East, and Middle East is a hopeless place. I'd like to offer, again, as a case study, a counter-argument to this. Iraqi Kurdistan, whether by design or by accident, in 1991, the United States, after Iraq invaded Kuwait and the Kurdish uprising against the regime, which was the Saddam Hussein regime, which for the Kurds was the Kurdish Spring, toppled a dictatorial regime by popular uprising, and then the troops came back to Kurdistan with a vengeance, and this is only 3 years after Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Kurds in Halabja, all of which happened in March. So March is a is a very emotional month for the Kurds. It brings about a emotional roller coaster. But the United States created a safe haven, started implementing it in late 1991, where Kurdistan was protected from the Iraqi army. The Kurds went for elections. They created a government that currently still exists, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and that introduced competitive politics to at least one part of Iraq. Now, of course, democracy, as we just learned, is chaotic, is messy, and these guys were Democrats with guns, so they started fighting each other. So there was a civil war. The United States didn't abandon Iraqi Kurdistan, but actually brought in those leaders who were fighting each other to Washington, D.C., made them kiss and make up, and make sure that this experience in nation building at least survives. When the Iraqi government attacked Kurdistan in 1996, the Clinton administration at the time responded by shooting cruise missiles at Baghdad in retaliation for breaking the safe haven that was imposed by the United Nations. Fast forward in 2003, the Kurds became useful, participated in the operation that toppled Saddam Hussein's regime. Fast forward again in 2014, when Kurdistan was in danger of an encroaching ISIS, the United States again came to the support of Kurdistan, protected it from ISIS. When the Kurds wanted to go for a referendum, and that was September of last year, the United States didn't go and stop them by force, but they, statements from the White House, from the State Department, pleading with the Kurds in private meetings, being probably more blunt than pleading. Do not go ahead with a referendum. There will be repercussions. We're not going to be able to protect you. You're fairly warned. The Kurds did it anyway, but nonetheless, and of course the repercussions for that is that the Kurds have lost some territory, some oil revenues. But when the Iraqi government was, exaggerating in the retaliation against the Kurds' move for independence, again, the United States sort of helped use its diplomacy to stop Baghdad from encroaching too much into the KRG. So what we have in Kurdistan is an example of low investment, but continued investment, both military, diplomatic, and financial, that has resulted in a partner that the United States can rely on at times. Not always. It's not a very, I'm not describing some, major alliance between two powers. Kurdistan is a small partner in this relationship. But in the war against ISIS, in fighting terrorism, in planning for Iraq invasion, this partner has been useful. And the Kurds have also benefited from this. Political pluralism in Kurdistan is a culture. When a party behaves in a certain way, when corruption is rampant, when the president decides to stay in office beyond his terms, everyone knows that this is wrong. Everyone knows that this is the wrong thing to do. Elections are sometimes, postponed and delayed for a variety of reasons and excuses, but nonetheless, the commitment, the political parties, the activism, the civil society, the free media, and again, please, I'm talking about Middle Eastern standards of free, democratic, plural, active. All of that is by Middle Eastern standards. But nonetheless, you have a vibrant civil society, a vibrant media landscape, universities that hold conferences, that really hold the governments to account, yell at them, shout at them. That competitive politics had at least thrived and survived despite its shortcomings. And that is in part thanks to U.S. commitment to safeguarding Kurdistan. To take this, make a broader point about this, the social contracts of Middle Eastern governments seems to, offer the people with major trade-offs. We have the new nascent democracies in which you lose economic development, you lose stability, you suffer from terrorism, and that's what you lose. But instead, you gain freedom, the freedom to speak, the freedom to vote, participation in elections. The hope of this president or this prime minister or this cabinet could be removed or toppled in the next round of elections. That seems to be the trade-off that these nascent democracies offer. But we also have the sort of military, single-party authoritarian regimes in which, yes, they offer stability, not so much economic development. but the kind of stability that, obviously did not work because that's what the Arab Spring proved wrong. We have the sort of Gulf state monarchical model in which, yes, the state provides you with economic development, they provide you with stability, but the cost that you have to pay for that is your different political freedoms, freedom of expression, and also the lack of public ability to hold that government accountable. Yes, some of these governments and states are lucky because they have friendly rulers that are very good to their people. As an Iraqi, I'm always scared by that model and scenario because Saddam Hussein was that kind of leader for a while. He is the one who built a hospital in every major city. He is the one who built all of the roads, many of the major universities. But when something went wrong and he decided to invade Kuwait and gas his own people, there was nothing in that society to hold this government accountable, change the behavior, or change him. So this trade-off seems to be the sort of tragedy of political systems and these social contracts that exist in our part of the world. I should also point out, again, from the Iraqi experience, because Iraq was ruled by a Ba'athist, socialist, Arab nationalist party, and today is being ruled by mainly Shia, Islamist parties. And maybe there's a lesson here also for the other democracies, and especially for the for Arab Spring in general, that fear of Islamists and Islamist politics. I think there's a lesson to be learned from Iraq. When Iraq had its first election in 2005, everyone ran on sectarian agendas, mainly on religious identities as well. So the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution, the Islamic Dawah Party, these were some the Islamic Party of Iraq. These were the main parties that participated in the Iraqi election. But these parties went to government. There were no coups. The people tried them. Their failures in governance, their failures in providing economic development had not. So the anger that has created has really changed not only the society but also the political landscape. If you look at the parties that are running for election in May, the names are Rule of Law, Civil Society Coalition, Victory Coalition, Iraqi Accord, National Accord Alliance. These parties had to change and remove those religious undertones, those sectarian undertones from the names because the people don't want that anymore. And if competitive politics gets a chance, then these ideological differences that's often in from Washington and from the West by way of terrorism, the fear of Islamist politics or anything that has a religious undertone, they play out. And the challenges of governance will prove that just having invoking the name of God is not going to give you godly powers to take care of the sewer system or create jobs or youth employment. The other point that I wanted to make quickly is about, we talk too much about politics and political competitiveness, but as it was mentioned, once you break that threshold, then the economic challenge becomes your main challenge. The bane of the Middle East, in addition to authoritarianism, has been this sort of Nasserist model that has permeated all of the Arab countries, in which every college graduate will get a job and pigeons are going to fall on your plates from the sky, and the economy is something that happens to you and then contributes to that passive role that society plays in the economy. And honestly, the politics, the economics, the trade, the media landscape has made governance in these countries too complex for these top-down approaches to be successful. Yes, we have some experiences going forward, but these challenges of creating jobs, of demographic changes, would require some sort of openness. Now, that openness could be democracy, could be tribal, could be through civil society, could be through media. These countries are finding their different ways, but this old style of the 70s and 80s and even 90s of top-down ruling by fiat and decree is simply not sustainable, not for an ideological reason, but just for the changes that have happened on the ground. And I just wanted to point out that now that the Iraqi politicians and political parties and Kurdish politicians and political parties are dealing with these realities, the questions of ideology, are not as relevant as they were, let's say, in 2005. But that's not good news, because the major challenges are still there, which is economic development, stability, fighting terrorism, creating institutions that have proven to be increasingly and more important than many in the civil society, in the sort of anti-authoritarian campaign used to think about. The idea was you get rid of the dictator and then life will be good. Governance is a lot more difficult and challenging than many thought, and I think so. To me, this is the opportunity for the United States. And this is the part that doesn't require lots of financial and military commitment, as long as there is a healthy mix of these tools of power that the United States have, and that long-term commitment, rather than these sort of 180 degrees of oscillation between two extremes. So I just wanted to share those maybe quick points from the experience of Iraq and Kurdistan, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bilal. So we've covered a lot of ground. So why don't we just open it up to the floor for questions based on the different presentations that we've heard here today. We have microphones in the back. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we can address them. You can address them to whoever's here on the panel. Okay. Dr. Clausen.
So it seems that many parts of the region, Egypt comes to mind. The conclusion of the events of 2011 has been that it's a mistake to make too dramatic change, and that we ought to have change which is modest and incremental, rather than going for profound change, because profound change can lead to instability, civil wars, and the breakdown of the national dialogue in Yemen. It looked so promising, and then Houthis blew that up. So I'd be interested in your comments on the limits to change, and what is an appropriate pace of change, and thoughts about how does one persuade that 40% of young people who are unemployed that change should come at a measured and modest pace when their situation seems to them to be very urgent.
Okay, interesting. Who'd like to tackle that?
Okay. Okay, I'll share maybe the Iraqi experience. Why don't we have a Kurdish insurgency or a Shia insurgency in Iraq, but we have a Sunni insurgency? It's because the Kurds have some hope in the process, giving them some fruits, some results. The Shia, while they're unhappy with their government and they're forcing these parties to change their identity and their platforms, they have hope in the parties and the representatives to deliver. The Sunnis lost that hope, and therefore they yielded to armed struggle against the central government. I mean, that's part of the answer, not the full answer. So what processes do we need to be in place to give the people the hope, not necessarily to offer solutions today, but give the people, the society, a vision, or at least a roadmap towards solutions that this government can offer? I don't have an answer for you, but at least the Iraqi experience shows that that level of voter and public accountability, and that level of communication, and having that representation is part of the answer.
No, it's also for Tunisia. as I said, the decentralization process and the participation of youngs in local governance, the philosophy of decentralization in our constitution is not to decentralize only power, but also the philosophy is that region to be in charge of themselves and be force of proposition, and the young would be in the center of decision making and of participating and force of proposition. So there is a changement also in mentality. It's not like the state will be also having given solution to young. It is you are a part of a solution. You should create your solution, and this is the philosophy. So we think that in local election would be this opportunity to make this changement for young people to accept this. Of course, it's not that easy, and that's why sometimes there is radicalization and so we have to be aware of this. We think also that education, that culture is very important, and inclusive policies also are very important to make this this bridge. The changes are in our also we have a very deep culture of educated youngs, of women also. Young women are 65% of our students are women, and this is also a force. Women are being very active in our society and engaged even in civil society, and also they are a part of force of proposition. So I think that's also a force in our country to be accelerating, I would say, the rhythm of this changement.
Well, I don't think there are many revolutions in the history of humankind that led directly and immediately to wonderful democracies and stable regimes. You know, one of the most iconic of them is the French Revolution, and you're probably aware of the oft-repeated, quip of Xu Anlai when he was asked in the 60s what he thought about the French Revolution. He said it's too early to say. So we should give the Arabs a little time. And to me, what's happening in Tunisia is kind of miraculous when you have that frame of, time frame in mind. And your observation suggested that it was premised on the idea that if the Egyptian revolution has failed, it had to do with the local politics and was because of endogenous factors, which is certainly true to some extent. But I would suggest that the geostrategic aspect of it played a role. There was a very interesting, short and very interesting article on Tunisia by a lady named Christine Krausch, whose title was "The Wonderful," I'm paraphrasing, "The Wonderful Geostrategic Insignificance of Tunisia." And that Tunisia basically had graduated to more stable democracy compared to the others because the world really didn't care. The stakes were not that high, geostrategically speaking, to have spoilers in the game. The big change between Tunisia and Egypt is that Egypt is geostrategically much more relevant. And beside that, you had really the rise of two major spoilers, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. They had intervened into the game. So you cannot, I don't think we can judge Egypt, and now even other countries' political situation without keeping that in mind, because I can tell you, for example, about Morocco, that the Emirati and Saudi involvement has a bearing on the internal politics in Morocco, because the Islamists have internalized the fact that that they can trigger the ire of the Saudis or the Emiratis, who can intervene and give a freer hand by sending money, etc., to the regime to clamp down on them, and it cowed their attitude nationally. So I think, well, since part of the of the discussion today was to talk a little bit about what the U.S. can do, not do, etc., etc. I think one way of looking at things is by having the U.S. to play a moderating role on the activities of the Saudis and the Emiratis in the region, to say things politely. and do no harm. I mean by that, I've been which is not on my very short bio is that I spent most of my professional life as a journalist in Morocco. And I'm no more a journalist because I was kicked out of my country by indirect means. And Morocco is one of the worst cases in terms of freedom of the press today. When you look at freedom of the press, Freedom House ranking, Reporters Without Borders, etc., 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 it has declined pretty much. Why am I evoking this aspect? It's because one way of convincing this 40-something% of unemployed people that they better be peaceful in their demands and patient, etc., etc. But it's by providing the space for debate. When you annihilate the agora, when the space does not exist for intellectuals, expert people to exchange ideas and to trade arguments, then how do you do that? You can't. The only means of actions have to be, and we are very fortunate that the means of actions that have been chosen are actually peaceful. But it's about taking to the streets, it's about strikes, etc., etc. So the other aspect that needs to be taken, that has to be in our minds when we analyze these countries, and it's getting a short shrift right now, is really freedom of expression and freedom of the press. And the situation is pretty bleak. And unfortunately, the partners of these regimes in the West are not mentioning these issues, which are key in promoting and producing the type of debates that are conducive to proper deliberation leading to solution. Someone said that democracy is the passage from physical violence to verbal violence. So
yeah, increasingly so. Okay, next question.
Mike. Thank you guys for your insights. It's really helpful. I have a question for you, Aboubakr, in terms of Morocco. So we've seen protests in the Reef and now in Jarada, and given what has happened to the Reef, all the over couple hundred people were arrested, put in prison. Now, there's still ongoing protests, but also in Jarada now. I think over the weekend there were two of the senior leaders were also arrested. So what do you see these protests, going forward? Because it seems what the government's trying to do is to try to contain it by putting people in prison, and when it comes to, in terms of the press freedom, those are the red lines that you're not able to write about and talk about. And then broader for the region, there's been protests also in Tunisia and Algeria. So where do you see this trend of people being engaged in these protests? Because basic needs are not being met. Can these protests over a long time change the way these governments and regimes are acting on press freedoms or on freedom of assembly?
No, my sentiment about what's happening in the north and this series of demonstrations at demand is that the government, the regime, not really the government, because the government in Morocco, the locus of power is the royal cabinet. Shouldn't delude ourselves about that. There is king number one, who's Mohammed VI, and king number two, who's Fouad Ali al-Himad, and the people around them. That's how real decisions are made in Morocco, and the rest is not for show entirely, but much less important than what seems to be said. The regime is at a loss because the regime believes that it has done what it needed to do in terms of providing the right economic model. If you go to Morocco, you'll be mesmerized by the modernity of the infrastructure, the airports, the roads, the highways, etc., etc. The problem, we know now, the World Bank wised up finally and came up with a report saying not all FDIs are equal and not all public investments are equal. And basically what the World Bank is saying without saying is when you don't have the proper institutional environment which allows a bottom-up demand process to happen, you end up with leaders coming up with these white elephants that are shiny and that are allow them to say, we are making great strides in modernity, but in fact it's not benefiting the population as it should. Why do we have that many highways and why don't we have enough hospitals, etc.? And the problem the regime is having with these movements, especially with the Reef one, I think they had 19 demands. Not one of them was political. They were not talking about democracy. They were talking about having hospitals. They were talking about having universities. They were talking about, and the problem to answer these demands, it's not by fiat. The economic model is failing because the institutional model is failing. To provide jobs, you need entrepreneurs, you need risk takers who feel comfortable enough to take these risks. You cannot have that type of institutional environment if the judiciary is completely under the helm of the monarchy. You know, one of the, to me, the saddest evolutions in Morocco is the judicial reform. They came up with this Orwellian argument that to make the judiciary independent, we should put it under the helm of the king. And that's what we have today. So we are supposed to have an attorney general and general prosecutor who's independent. He's not independent. He's appointed by the king, which means that he's serving the interests of the power elites around the king. And all that leads to an institutional situation where people are not willing to invest. So we end up with these massive public investments, which are quantitatively impressive, but qualitatively, in fact, poor because they're not producing the equality, the wealth redistribution. They're not producing the jobs they need to produce. And unfortunately, we did not reach the point where the public opinion is convinced that we need to go to square one. We need to go back to the Constitution because the 2011 Constitution is a wonderful manifesto. It says all the right things in terms of minorities, but it's a very bad Constitution. It's not providing the mechanisms to actually actualize these wonderful values that are promoted in the preface of the Constitution.
Quickly, just to add something on the protests also in Tunisia. I mean, coming this morning, I saw hundreds of students that they were protesting for the, So I think should be understood as part of the democracy. It is actually a good and healthy way to hear and to listen of our voters, people, citizens, that they have their concerns and they have their, this is their way to express their voices. There is civil society activities, but also I think protesting and shouting, it is part of this. So in Tunisia, we get used to this. I think in front of the parliament, mostly not every day, but I think it is part. And we go out and to talk to them, and we hear them. They're not happy all the time actually with what we say to them, but this is it. I mean, we have to learn how to answer in a better way to their concerns, but on long term, I mean, the state, the democratic one in the Arab world, must move to be to provide real opportunity for them. So we have to prove to ourselves that democracy in the Arab world can work really and can be another good chance for freedom, not only but also to improve and to solve the differences that we have on the how to do reforms and to develop our economy. So including them, youth today, if you come to the parliament in Tunisia, you're going to see really a lot of them that they are in the parliament with their website saying to everyone if this MP came to vote today or if he's absent, why, if he was in the commission, what they are discussing in the commission, what did they vote and what they did not, and so on. So this is part of our inclusion. And we did a lot of efforts also in Tunisia in the electoral law. So it is not easy, of course, to just tell them, okay, be part of the system. Otherwise, others, they're going to take them outside of the system. And here we have ISIS and extremism and so on. So this is the battle that we have to understand. And the good news that we have is not fantastic news because the numbers are not that very, very good, but there are good news. So with the electoral law that we did with the political parties, they must candidate in the first places youth under 35 and women and so on. So there is a good participation of youth, at least for now, in the lists, and we have more than 2,000 lists, and we'll see that this is going also to impact the participation of youth to the election. And step by step, and trying to correct our mistakes, we're going to have a better inclusion in our country.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. I'd like to ask a question about Tunisia, and I want to caveat the question by saying this may be a difficult and perhaps provocative question to ask, but I'd like to ask it. And so, in Tunisia, it seems like we have a large gap between expectations and actual performance, at least in terms of the economy, looking at the dignity side of the equation. And it seems like that gap perhaps has grown since 2011 in terms of the opportunities people feel are available to them, the gap between expectations and performance. So my question is, at what stage do you feel or do you fear that Tunisians will come to associate the democratic opening and their country's democratization with economic chaos, and thus that will result in a disillusionment with democracy itself? And the example that comes to mind, and I want to minimize the comparison because it doesn't hold up under all metrics, but the example that might come to mind would be Russia in the 1990s, whereby you have a democratic opening, you have the economy over time performing poorly, and you seem to have a disillusionment on the part of Russians with democracy itself. And of course, we all know how that turned out. So without overdoing the comparison, I don't want to do that, I would like to ask, is there a time that you feel like you would fear extreme disillusionment with democracy itself if the economy doesn't pick up?
Okay. Would you like to address that?
Both.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the question. Is of course that there is, as I said, the problem in making and advancing in economic transition and enhancing reforms. But we have this culture also always of creating ad hoc committees and solutions to advance. So I would say we have created this political institution and we are advancing on them, and this is consuming time, consuming resources, consuming energy, consuming attention. So now we are aware we have red lines regarding the budget, the purchase power, regard even for investment. We have this reform of investment, but it's not implemented, and we have delays in making these reforms. And so actually we are in a strategic moment when we have to see and diagnose what is not going on and to create new mechanisms of improving them. So I think that there is always a hope. We are believing in genie Tunisians that will succeed. But of course, we are not alone. We are partners. We have Europe. You have a lot of, So we should first make the deep diagnosis of the situation. We should not be this rosy things and everything is going on, but we should say, okay, these are our problem. Why it doesn't happen? Why? So is it a problem of only administration, of only political wills, governance, etc., and how can we address them? So, but I think that we of course there is a hope for this, of course.
Quick to add, not much. I actually have the same view. The risk is there, honestly, and the risk is we're going to see it in the number of Tunisians that are going to participate to the vote on 6th of May. So, big step. We're going to do the election of localities, and it is a big step. It's a huge, important implementation of the new constitution. But at the same time, we don't know how many Tunisians they're going to go to vote, and the risk is there. And that's why we're here. We're here to dialogue, to discuss, to hear from you, and also to say that Tunisia needs to continue to be supported. it is really important. Otherwise, I mean, if we cannot provide not only freedom but also jobs and a better opportunity and better schools and so on, it is not going to be good for Tunisia. And I'm saying numbers still not good, but they are going in the right direction. So we need really to support this direction. And accidents can happen, and accidents can really make it really difficult for Tunisia. So my point is the risk is there. We're really concerned about this. We know where to see and how to try to face this risk. We're trying to do all our effort to have a democratic, inclusive way, and trying to have a lot of participation from women, youth, and so on. But I mean, the results are not they're not matching our expectation. We need the support of the countries that they want a real democracy in North Africa.
Okay, Ray Tanter.
Thank you. Stephen Rukins mentioned or hinted at what I would call the gap between expectations and aspirations as being the revolutionary gap. In '67, before I think Lubna was born probably, I penned a piece on this issue of using some of the indicators that both Oussama and Aboubakr mentioned, and we found that the greater the gap between expectations and aspirations, the more likely it was a revolution to occur. And I think this is a case where this is a situation where you can combine quantitative case with case study, qualitative analysis. And I think more of that has to be done. And I wonder why that hasn't been done.
Part of my job is to organize study tours, and I take American students to Morocco. And one of the things I ask them to pay attention to is what's on the roofs of the shanty towns. Satellite dishes. So in other words, the kids in Morocco, they know about Rihanna, they know about Jay-Z, they know about Nike, they know about... So this is of course, this is a bit of a caricatured way of looking at it, but my point is that the expectations are high because they know what they are missing on, contrary to their parent, to their grandparent. They know what's out there that they don't have. They don't like the fact that they don't have it. And besides, one of the very important evolution we did not mention today in the region is the precipitous decline of the fertility rate in the region, which is almost unheard of in modern times for the whole humanity. Morocco's fertility rate went from that's the number of kids women have, went from 4.7, I think, in 1982 to 2.4 in 2005. The same evolution happened in France in the span of 160 years. You don't have a society that does not undergo such a massive change without some major value clashes, etc., etc. And it also says something about the modernization of the society. The peacefulness and the civilized nature of the protest in Morocco, to me, is explained by this modernization process, because that's how it's one of the indicators of a society's modernization is the precipitous decline or the decline of fertility rate, because what it means, women have more time on their hand, they participate more. It means also that men accept the notion that the probability of having a boy is less, so they accept that, and they accept that their women go out to work, etc., etc. So it has a very important impact on the society. So yes, the expectations are extremely high, and we are faced with...
Relative to the aspirations.
Sorry?
Relative to the aspirations, are the expectations high? That's the question. Yeah.
Between the...
aspirations and expectations.
Sorry, I don't get the difference. What do you mean by aspirations? So
aspire.
Yeah.
And you
Well, okay. Yes, of course, because by expectations you mean what they think realistically can happen given the conditions. Of course, there is a gap, but the good news again is that even though I think it's the case of many countries, in Morocco the case is even stronger for that, because one of the issues about Morocco, that Morocco is the worst country in the region after Yemen in terms of HDI, Human Development Index. A war-torn Iraq is ranking better than Morocco in the HDI ranking. So there are some improvements that have happened, but in absolute terms, you have more educated people. In absolute terms, so you have the IQ of the population is higher than before. Somehow, I know that the parallel is not 100% solid, but people are more able intellectually to comprehend the situation and to come up with reasonable demands and reasonable views on what is achievable or not. And we can see that in the demands during the demonstrations. We can see that I'm flabbergasted by how articulate are people. You know, when I say all these YouTube posts from some remote villages in Morocco, how people who clearly are not educated are able to articulate their demands. And I see really an evolution in their intellectual abilities to deal with the political realities of their country. And to me, this is a good point, despite all the other rather dire elements.
Great.
I don't know if I answered.
Lobna, do you have anything else to add?
Just wanted to add just one statistical point here is there was a report, the UNDP's Arab Human Development Report had an interesting conclusion about how Arab youth is not interested in participating in elections in mass, and yet they're more inclined to protest. And the report also shows that Arab protest movements tend to come in 5-year cycles. And that probably goes into the sort of gap between expectations and aspirations and what the government can deliver. But if those protests result in inching reforms forward, and rather than being more disruptive, because so far some of them have been actually, the protest has taken the country or the political system backwards, and in other cases it has taken them forward. And that's the part that I say that a stable enough competitive political system and politics is necessary for those bouts of protest to at least be moving things forward. And some of the examples that I mentioned about Iraq, about how the identity of the parties are changing, about how the society is trying to come together, how the priority is changing from identity to policy and governance and service delivery, that would probably at least in the case of Iraq, an expected and rather positive response to avoid those bouts of protests.
Yes, just a quick is that it's a loop. It's we have this disappointment and in terms of aspiration, and then we have this for our country. You have always come back and change government, and you have a new aspiration, I would say, and then we are disappointed. But what I think that Churchill have said something would be maybe applicable is that from the success is from failure to failure. We have to be enthusiastic. And this is, I think, what you have to do is to keep enthusiastic in this loop. Thank you.
Yes, in the Middle East and in Washington, we need to be optimistic. So on that happy note, for a change, please join me in thanking our panelists today. We wish you all the best of luck on the rest of your trip, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.